My name is Elena Vance, and for 24 years, I was the ghost in my own home. I was the one who scrubbed the baseboards before my sister's unboxing videos, the one who stayed in the kitchen during my mother's lavish dinner parties, and the one who was told I didn't fit the aesthetic of our family brand. My mother Sandra and my sister Chloe lived their lives through a camera lens, chasing a billionaire lifestyle on a middle-class credit limit. But 3 days ago, my grandfather, man they called a senile hermit, passed away. When the lawyer opened the will, my mother was already picking out a new yacht in her head. She didn't realize that for 10 years, I was the only person who visited him without a ring light in my hand. And I'm about to show her exactly what happens when the ghost finally decides to speak. Growing up in our house wasn't about being loved, it was about being curated. My mother Sandra was a woman who saw every room as a set and every conversation as a potential viral clip. Chloe, my sister, was her masterpiece blonde, photogenic, and perfectly willing to perform. I was the logistics manager, which was a fancy word for the person who did the laundry, cooked the meals, and made sure the background of their videos looked like a luxury mansion instead of the three-bedroom ranch in Ohio that it actually was. I wasn't allowed in the photos because my hair was too flat or my clothes were too basic. "You have a face for radio, Elena," Chloe would say, laughing, as she handed me her dirty makeup brushes to clean. The only person who didn't care about lighting or aesthetics was my grandfather, Arthur Vance. He had been estranged from my mother for a decade. Sandra told everyone he was difficult and losing his mind, but the truth was much simpler. He refused to give her money to fund her fake life. Every Sunday, while my mother and Chloe were at the brunch spots that had the best natural light, I would drive 40 minutes to his small cottage. We'd sit on his porch, and he'd teach me things they never taught in school: how to read a balance sheet, how to spot a lie in a contract, and why old money never shouts. He knew exactly what was happening at home. He saw the way I arrived in a car that needed a new muffler while my mother was leasing a Mercedes she couldn't afford. "They're building a house of cards, Elle," he told me once, his hands steady as he poured tea. "And when the wind blows, you're the only one who's going to have a foundation." I thought he was just being supportive, but Arthur Vance was a man who never said a word he hadn't already backed up with a signature. That the news of his death came on a Tuesday. My mother didn't cry for him. She cried because the funeral coincided with a brand partnership shoot. But her mood changed the moment the probate attorney called. "Arthur was a billionaire, Chloe. Do you know what this means?" she shrieked, already scrolling through real estate listings in Malibu. They assumed the senile hermit had nowhere else to leave his fortune but to his only daughter and favorite granddaughter. They didn't even ask if I wanted to go to the will reading. "You can stay here and handle the cater for the celebration of life party," Sandra said, checking her reflection. "We'll tell you your share later. It'll be enough for a nice little apartment somewhere far away." But as I sat in the kitchen staring at the guest list for a party for a man they hadn't seen in years, my phone buzzed. It was a private number. "Miss Vance? This is Marcus Thorne, your grandfather's attorney. I believe your mother forgot to mention that your presence is mandatory for the reading today." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the piles of laundry and the dirty dishes left behind by the stars of the family. I didn't say a word to them. I put on my good blazer, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. When I walked into the law office, my mother's face turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be prepping the appetizers," she hissed. Chloe didn't even look up from her phone. "She probably wants to beg for a new car," Chloe muttered. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, his eyes lingering on me with a strange sort of respect. He opened the heavy leather folder and began to read. The room went silent. My mother leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with greed. But as Marcus reached to the third page, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Marcus Thorne didn't even look up as my mother practically vibrated out of her chair. He adjusted his glasses and read the words that would dismantle my family's house of cards. "To my daughter, Sandra Vance, I bequeath the sum of $500 as a gesture of the value she placed on our relationship over the last decade." The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Chloe's phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the mahogany table. $500? She whispered, her face pale under her layers of contour. Marcus continued as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb. To my granddaughter, Chloe Vance. I leave my collection of vintage cameras. Perhaps now she will learn to look at the world through a lens without herself in the center of the frame. Chloe let out a sharp, choked sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. Just he didn't want cameras. She wanted the Malibu estate and the trust fund she'd already spent in her head. Then, Marcus turned his gaze to me. And to my granddaughter, Elena Vance, who visited me every Sunday without fail, who listened to my stories when no one else would, and who never once asked me for a single cent. I leave the remainder of my estate, including all real property, the Vance Global Holdings, and the controlling interest in the family trust. The silence was broken by my mother's scream. "That's impossible! He was senile. He was manipulated," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. You've been whispering in his ear for years, haven't you? You little rat." Chloe was crying now, real tears that actually ruined her expensive mascara. "It's not fair, Elena. You don't even know what to do with that money. You're a servant." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I sat there, feeling the weight of the mahogany box my grandfather had given me months ago, finally understand why he told me to keep it locked. Inside wasn't jewelry or gold. It was the original, unedited ledger of every loan my mother had taken from him under false pretenses. Money she claimed was for my education, which had actually gone toward her designer handbags and Chloe's modeling portfolio. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice sounding more like my grandfather's than I ever realized. "What is the total value of the remainder?" Marcus smiled, a sharp, clinical expression. "Current valuations of the Vance holdings exceed $4 billion, Elena." Sandra collapsed back into her chair, her face the color of old paper. $4 billion. To the daughter she had treated like a ghost. To the girl she had ordered to prep appetizers for a party she was now technically the host of. But the shock was only the beginning. My mother, never one to let a tragedy go to waste, suddenly changed her tone. Her eyes, still wet with tears of fury, softened into a look of practiced, maternal warmth. "Elena, honey, we're all just in shock. You know we love you. We can go home and talk about this as a family. We'll help you manage everything." I stood up, smoothing my blazer. "I don't think so, Sandra," I said. "The cottage? The one you called a dump? It's part of the estate. And the ranch house you currently live in? It turns out grandfather bought it through a hold company 10 years ago to keep you from being homeless. I'm technically your landlord now." Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You wouldn't kick us out," she whispered. I looked at her, thinking of all the times she'd made me sleep on the couch so her content team could use my bedroom for a shoot. "I'm not kicking you out," I said. "But the lifestyle you've been living on grandfather's secret generosity is over." The Mercedes lease? Cancelled. The credit cards? Blocked. From now on, you live on the $500 he left you. As I walked out of the office, my mother's voice followed me, rising into a screech that echoed off the marble walls. "You'll regret this, Elena. I'll sue you for everything. Emotional distress, elder abuse. I'll tell the world what a monster you are." I didn't look back. I had a billion-dollar empire to stabilize and a cottage to visit done last time. But as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a notification from Chloe's Instagram. She had already posted a tearful video titled "My Sister Stole Our Inheritance." The war hadn't just started, it had gone viral. The video was barely 3 minutes old, but the comments were already a battlefield. Chloe was a master of the crying on camera aesthetic, the perfect amount of redness around the eyes, the shaky breath, the strategically messy hair that still look expensive. "I never thought my own sister would do this," she sobbed into her phone, the ring light reflecting in her pupils. "She manipulated our poor, sick grandfather into signing over everything. My mom and I are being threatened with homelessness. Please, I just need justice." I sat in my car, watching the view count climb. 10,000. 50,000. My mother, Sandra, had already shared it to her Facebook inner circle, adding a caption about the heartbreak of a mother's betrayal. They were playing the only card they had left: public sympathy. In their world, if enough people liked a lie, it became the truth. But I wasn't the girl who took orders anymore. I drove straight to my grandfather's cottage, the place that was now officially my sanctuary. It was a modest stone building, tucked away from the main road, but as I pulled into the gravel drive, I saw a black SUV parked near the porch. Marcus Thorne was waiting for me, hold a thick stack of papers and a small, encrypted tablet. "The social media storm is predictable, Elena," Marcus said, his voice as dry as parchment. "But your grandfather anticipated this. He didn't just leave you money, he left you a defense." He handed me the tablet. Dot on the screen was a series of video files, dated over the last 5 years. I clicked the most recent toe. It was my grandfather, Arthur, sitting in his favorite armchair. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, focusing directly on the camera. "If you're watching this," Arthur's voice filled the small room, "it means Sandra is doing exactly what she did to her mother, turning her greed into a performance. She'll claim I was senile. She'll claim Elena coerced me." He held up a copy of a medical evaluation. "This is a clean bill of health from 3 different neurologists, recorded the same day I updated my will. And these," he gestured to a pile of folders, "are the receipts." The folders contained a decade of recorded phone calls. Got calls from my mother, Sandra, screaming at him for more money, threatening to keep me away from him if he didn't pay for Chloe's European content tour. Calls where Chloe herself laughed about how easy I was to use as a maid. My grandfather hadn't just been a senile hermit. He had been a silent observer, documenting the slow decay of his daughter's character. "What do you want to do with these?" Marcus asked. "Your mother's lawyer has already filed for an emergency injunction to freeze the accounts. They're claiming undue influence." I looked out the window at the garden Arthur had spent 40 years tending. I thought about the thousands of hours I'd spent scrubbing floors while they lived a lie on a dying man's dime. "We don't release them yet," I said quietly. "Sandra wants to sue for emotional distress? Let her, Dot. Let her file the paperwork. Let her go on every morning show that will have her. Let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly can." I spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of corporate briefings. The Vance holdings were massive, but Arthur had designed them to be managed by a core team of loyalists who had been waiting for me. They didn't see an aesthetic or a brand. They saw a woman who knew the ledgers better than anyone else, because I was the only one Arthur had actually taught. On the 3rd day, the lawsuit arrived. Sandra wasn't just asking for a share, she was suing for the entire estate, plus punitive damages for the trauma of being evicted from her home. Just she had hired a high-profile celebrity lawyer who specialized in public scandals. They held a press conference on the lawn of the ranch house, Chloe standing by her side in a black dress that looked like it was from a funeral, holding a handkerchief. "My daughter Elena has been radicalized by greed," Sandra told the cameras, her voice trembling with practiced perfection. "She's forgotten the family that raised her. We just want her to get help. We just want what's fair." That night, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sandra. "Elena, we can end all of this. Just give us the 10% Chloe and I agreed on, and we'll drop the suit. Don't make us destroy you." I didn't reply. Instead, I called Marcus. "It's time," I said, "but I don't want a press conference. I want to invite them to the cottage for a private negotiation. Tell them to bring their cameras." They love an audience, don't they? When they arrived the next morning, they looked like they were walking onto a movie set. Sandra was draped in silk, and Chloe had a portable lighting rig being carried by a nervous-looking assistant. They walked into the small living room, looking around with visible disgust. "You've come to your senses," Sandra said, sitting on Arthur's old sofa as if she were afraid she'd catch poverty from the cushions. "Let's sign the papers and get out of this dump." I stood by the mantel, the mahogany box in my hand. "I invited you here to show you something," I said. "Grandfather knew you would say he was senile. He knew you would say I coerced him." I picked up the tablet and pressed play. As Arthur's voice filled the room, the color drained from Sandra's face. But it wasn't the medical report that stopped it. It was the recording of the call from 3 years ago. One where she told Arthur that if he didn't send $50,000 by Friday, she would tell the police I was stealing from him to get me arrested. That's... that's a fabrication, Sandra stammered, her eyes darting to Chloe's camera assistant. Turn that off. Chloe, stop him. It's not a fabrication, Sandra, I said, stepping forward. And it's not the only one. I have 10 years of these. I have every fraudulent expense report you ever filed. And I have the video of you and Chloe yesterday laughing about how much content you're going to get out of the lawsuit. Chloe looked at the camera rig, then at me, her face twisting. You can't use those. It's illegal to record Peep. Actually, Marcus Thorne said, stepping out from the kitchen. In this state, it's a one-party consent law. And Arthur was very thorough. I looked at my mother, the woman who had made me a ghost. You want to sue me for emotional distress? Go ahead. But the moment you file that first motion in court, these videos go to every news outlet in the country. Your brand, Sandra? It'll be gone. You won't be a grieving daughter. You'll be a documented extortionist. Sandra let out a low, animalistic growl. You think you're so smart. You think you've won? I don't think I've won, I said, my voice cold. I think I'm finally taking the trash out. You have 24 hours to withdraw the suit and move out of the ranch house. If you do, I'll provide you with a modest monthly allowance, the same amount you gave me when I was working for you. If you don't, well, I hope you like the lighting in a courtroom. As they scrambled out of the cottage, Chloe's assistant accidentally knocked over a lamp, and for the first time, Chloe didn't care about the shot. She was looking at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Genuine, unscripted fear. But as the dust settled, Marcus Thorne looked at me with a frown. You were very generous with that allowance, Elena. Why? I looked at the garden, thinking of my grandfather's final words on the tape. Because, I said, Arthur wanted them to have exactly what they deserved. And nothing is more painful for people like them than having to live a basic life that they can't afford to hide. The 24-hour deadline I'd set felt like a long, low vibration that settled into the bones of the cottage. I didn't spend that time checking social media. I spent it with Marcus Thorne and the Vance executive team, beginning the process of auditing the family expenses that had been bled from the company for years. Every designer handbag, every leased sports car, every PR consultant fee that was actually just a bribe for a gossip columnist was laid out in black and white. Sandra and Chloe didn't withdraw the suit in an hour. They didn't even withdraw it in 10. They were still convinced that they could win the war of optics. But at the 23rd hour, the tone shifted. Chloe's celebrity lawyer suddenly held a second, much quieter press conference. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps he had just seen the legal team I had assembled. My clients have decided to prioritize family healing over litigation, he announced to a much smaller group of reporters. They are withdrawing the suit to allow for a private resolution. The private resolution was that they were moving out. I watched the live stream of them packing up the ranch house from my tablet. Chloe was still filming, trying to spin their eviction as a minimalist journey into authentic living, but the cracks were showing. They weren't taking the grand piano or the imported Italian marble statues. They were taking what would fit into a mid-sized U-Haul because the professional movers had refused to work without a deposit I was no longer paying. What's next, Elena? Marcus asked as we sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset over the valley. Next is the audit, I said. I want to know where every cent of Arthur's money went, and I want to see if any of it can be recovered. I didn't expect what we found in the third-floor safe of the Vance headquarters. It wasn't just receipts. It was a secondary will, a smaller, more specific document that Arthur had hidden away for me to find only after I'd taken control. In it, Arthur revealed the true reason for the estrangement from my mother. It wasn't just the money. Years ago, Sandra had tried to sell the Vance family's original patent, the foundation of their entire fortune, to a rival firm to settle a gambling debt she'd accrued in Monte Carlo. Arthur had blocked the sale and covered the debt, but he'd cut her off emotionally that very day. She didn't just want my money, Elle, Arthur wrote in a private note tucked inside the document. She wanted to destroy the legacy I built for you. She sees you as the threat because you are the only one who actually understands the value of what we've created. The realization that my mother hadn't just neglected me, but had actively tried to bankrupt my future, turned the last of my hesitation into stone. I called for a meeting of the Vance Global Board. For the first time, I sat at the head of the long table in the glass-walled boardroom tyke. I didn't look like the girl who prepped appetizers anymore. I wore a suit that was tailored, sharp, and unmistakably expensive. Because I cared about the aesthetic, but because I knew that in this room, image was the first layer of defense. I am initiating a full clawback of fraudulent expenses billed to this company over the last 5 years, I told the board. The room went silent. These were men and women who had watched Arthur for decades, and now they were seeing his eyes in mine. This includes the personal leases for Sandra Vance and the promotional budget for Chloe Vance's social media ventures. Every dollar that cannot be tied to a legitimate business purpose will be pursued. One of the older board members, a man named Sterling, who had been Arthur's contemporary, leaned forward. Elena, that will bankrupt your mother and sister. They have no assets other than the allowance you've promised. Then they will have to learn what it means to live within their means, I replied. Arthur spent a lifetime building this. I won't let his legacy be used as a piggy bank for people who didn't even bother to say goodbye to him. The board voted unanimously to support the audit. That night, my phone didn't just buzz, it screamed. Sandra was calling from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, she wasn't performing anymore. She was hysterical. You can't do this, Elena. The lawyers say you're suing us for the cars. We don't have the money. We spent it, she screamed. We're in a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town where people don't even have gates. Chloe has been crying for 12 hours. Then sell the jewelry, Sandra, I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. Sell the bags. Sell the content. You wanted the billionaire lifestyle? This is the billionaire's responsibility. Every debt must be paid. I am your mother, she squeaked. And Arthur was your father? I countered. You treated him like a bank, and you treated me like a ghost. The bank is closed, Sandra, and the ghost is finally haunting you. I hung up. But as I sat in the quiet of the office, Marcus Thorne walked in with a grim expression. We have a problem, he said, holding up a tablet. Chloe isn't just crying. She's gone to a rival firm, the same as your mother tried to sell the patent 2 years ago. They're offering to fund her legal battle in exchange for inside information on the Vance Global patents. I looked at the screen. Chloe was pictured leaving a high-rise office building with a man I recognized from Arthur's enemy list. She's not just chasing an inheritance anymore, I whispered. She's trying to finish what Sandra started. She's going to try to sell the company from the outside. I looked at Arthur's old ledger, the one that listed every lie and every loan. Marcus, get the security team and call the patent office. We're not just auditing them anymore, we're going to war. But as I reached for my coat, I saw a new notification on the Vance Global internal server. Someone had logged in from a remote location using a password Arthur had given me, a password that shouldn't have been active. The screen flashed red. Data breach in progress, it read. I looked at the location of the login. It was the ranch house. They hadn't moved out everything yet. They were still in the building, and they were taking the one thing Arthur had tried to protect his entire life. At you. The red flashing text on the tablet felt like a countdown to the end of everything Arthur had built. They're not just taking files, Marcus, I whispered, my eyes scanning the rapid data transfer logs. They're downloading the core encryption keys for the Vance Global infrastructure. If Chloe and Sandra successfully handed those to Arthur's rivals, the company wouldn't just be bankrupt, it would be compromised beyond repair. I've alerted the cybersecurity team to initiate a remote wipe, but they've bypassed the standard admin protocols, Marcus said, his voice tight as he coordinated with the security detail. They're using Arthur's emergency master key, a physical hardware token he must have hidden in that ranch house safe. I didn't wait for the security team to assemble. I was already out the door of the cottage, the gravel spraying beneath my tires as I floored the accelerator. The drive to the ranch house, which usually took 20 minutes, felt like an eternity. My mind raced through the patterns Arthur had taught me. He always said that greed makes people predictable, but desperation makes them dangerous. As I pulled into the long driveway of the ranch house, I saw the U-Haul still parked by the front door, half loaded with the remnants of their superficial life. The house was dark, except for the blue glow emanating from the window of Arthur's old study. I burst through the front door, the silence of the foyer a sharp contrast to the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I reached the study just as Chloe was pulling a silver USB drive from the port of a hidden wall terminal. Sandra stood behind her, clutching a stack of physical blueprints like they were lifelines. "Give it to me, Chloe," I said, my voice low and dangerous. Chloe jumped, nearly dropping the drive, her face a mask of sweat and panic. "You're too late, Elena. The transfer is already 90% complete. We have a buyer meeting us in an hour. We're finally going to get the life we deserve." "You're going to get 20 years in a federal prison," I countered, stepping into the room. "That's corporate espionage, Sandra. You're not just suing for a will anymore, you're stealing national interest patents." Sandra let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. "They're our patents. They belong to the Vance family, and we are the only real Vances left. You're just the help that got lucky." I saw Chloe's eyes dart toward the door, her hand tightening around the drive. She made a break for it, trying to shove past me, but I grabbed her arm. The strength I'd developed from years of manual labor far outpaced her lifestyle-focused gym sessions. We struggled, the drive skid across the floor and disappearing under a heavy oak desk. "You think you're so much better than us," Chloe screamed, her perfect nails digging into my wrists. "You were always the ghost. You were supposed to stay in the shadows." "The ghost is the only one who saw the truth, Chloe," I said, pinning her arm back. At that moment, the lights in the study flickered and died. The blue glow of the terminal vanished. Marcus Thorne's voice crackled through my phone, which was lying on the desk. "Elena, we did it. We cut the house's local server connection from the main grid. The transfer failed at 98%. The data they have is fragmented and useless." Sandra let out a guttural cry of rage, lunging toward me, but she tripped over a discarded designer shoebox, crashing into a stack of mirrors Chloe had been packing. The sound of shattering glass filled the room, a fitting soundtrack for the final collapse of their vanity. The high-beam flashlights of the security team flooded the room seconds later. Marcus walked in, looking at the wreckage of the study and the wreckage of my mother and sister. With a look of profound exhaustion. "The police are at the gate, Elena," he said quietly. I looked at Sandra, who was sitting amidst the shards of glass, her silk dress torn, her eyes wide and vacant. She looked at the blueprints in her hand, then at me. And for the first time, she didn't have a script. She didn't have a camera. She didn't even have a lie. "I'm not filing the charges," I said. The words surprising even me. Marcus turned to me, shocked. "Elena, they tried to destroy the company. They tried to sell the patents." "I know," I said, looking at Chloe, who was being handcuffed by a security guard. "But if I send them to prison, they become martyrs for their followers. They become a tragedy. I want them to have something much worse." I stepped over the broken glass and knelt in front of my mother. "The audit stands, Sandra. You will pay back every cent of the fraudulent expenses. We will seize the bags, the jewelry, and the remaining cars to settle the debt. And the allowance I promised? It's gone." "You're leaving us with nothing?" Sandra whispered. "I'm leaving you with the ranch house," I said. "But not as owners. I'm converting it into a housing facility for the Vance Foundation's educational programs. You can stay in the basement apartment, the same size as the room you forced me into for 10 years. You'll work as the custodial staff. You wanted to live on Vance property? Now you'll earn it." Chloe looked at me, her face contorted in horror. "You want us to be the maids?" "I want you to be the ghosts," I said, standing up. "Every time a student walks through these halls to build a future you tried to steal, they'll see you scrubbing the floors, and they won't even know your names." As the security team led them out to be processed for the initial trespass, I found the silver USB drive under the desk. I didn't hand it to Marcus. I walked to the fireplace, where a few embers from Sandra's clearing out fire were still glowing, and dropped it in. "Arthur's secrets stay with me," I told Marcus. The legacy isn't in the patents or the money. It's in the work. But as I walked out of the ranch house for the last time, Marcus Thorne caught my arm. Elena, there's one more thing. The rival firm Chloe met with? They've gone silent. But we found out who was funding them. It wasn't a rival company. He handed me a final document. It was Sandra's sister. Your Aunt Margaret. The one who disappeared 20 years ago after a fight with Arthur. I looked at the signature on the funding agreement. It was a name I hadn't heard since I was a toddler. She's coming for the other half of the estate, Elena, Marcus whispered. And unlike Sandra, she doesn't care about a camera. She knows where all the bodies are buried.
The name Margaret Vance, now Margaret Sterling, felt like a cold draft blowing through a room I thought I'd finally sealed shut. I looked at the signature on the funding agreement Marcus held. It was sharp, elegant, and devoid of the desperate flourishes that characterized my mother's handwriting. While Sandra had been playing for likes and followers, Aunt Margaret had been playing for the long game, waiting for the precisely right moment to strike at the heart of the Vance empire.
She's not in the ranch house basement, Elena, Marcus said, his face shadowed by the dim light of the study. She's in a penthouse in New York, and she's spent the last 2 decades building a hedge fund that specializes in hostile takeovers. Margaret hadn't just disappeared. She had evolved. She was the black sheep. Because she was the only wed Arthur feared. The one who was just as smart as him, but twice as ruthless. I stood in the center of the ruined study, surrounded by the broken glass of my mother's vanity, and realized that my battle with Sandra and Chloe had merely been the prologue. They were the noise. Margaret was the signal. Marcus, we don't have 24 hours this time, I said, my voice hardening into the leadership tone Arthur had spent those Sundays cultivating. If she's funding Chloe's betrayal, she's already mapped out our weaknesses. We need to find the thing Arthur left that wasn't in the safe. Arthur had always told me that the greatest secret of the Vance family wasn't a patent or a bank account. It was the Sunday ledger. A physical book he kept in the garden shed, hidden inside a hollowed-out bag of potting soil. He said it was the only record of the original sin that led to Margaret's exile. I drove back to the cottage as the first hint of dawn touched the valley. I didn't use the lights. I knew the path by heart. I found the shed, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rosemary. I dug through the bags of soil until my fingers hit something hard and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the ledger was the truth about Margaret Vance. She hadn't been exiled for a fight over money. She had been exiled because 20 years ago, she had falsified the environmental safety reports for the family's first major manufacturing plant to save $100 million in construction costs. Arthur had found out and spent 5 years quietly cleaning up the toxic mess she'd left behind, using his own fortune to protect the thousands of families living near the site. Margaret didn't just want the money. She wanted to bury the evidence before the statute of limitations on the environmental crimes expired. At 9 a.m., Aunt Margaret arrived at the Vance Global headquarters. She didn't bring a camera rig or a publicist. She brought 4 men in charcoal suits and a briefcase that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. She walked into the boardroom where I was waiting, her presence so commanding that the air seemed to crystallize around her. "You look like Arthur," she said, her voice a smooth, dangerous melody. "But you have your mother's chin. It's a weakness." "I have my grandfather's ledger, Margaret," I replied, sliding the oilcloth-wrapped book across the table. The one from 2006. The one with the real soil samples from the Oak Ridge site. Margaret's eyes didn't flicker, but the corner of her mouth tightened. Arthur was always a sentimental fool. He thought he was saving the world. He was just wasting capital. He was saving people from the poison you put in the ground, I said. And I've already sent a digital copy of these logs to the EPA and the state prosecutor's office. Your hedge fund. It's about to become the largest environmental cleanup project in history. The silence in the room lasted for 10 seconds. Then, Margaret stood up. She didn't scream like Sandra. She didn't cry like Chloe. She simply looked at me with a terrifying, clinical respect. "You're not the ghost, Elena," she whispered. "You're the architect. Arthur didn't leave you an inheritance. He left you a fortress." She walked out, her charcoal-suited sentries following in a perfect silent line. A month later, the Vance Global headquarters was a different place. The aesthetic had been replaced by authentic work. I had dissolved the PR department that funded my family's vanity and replaced it with an environmental justice initiative in Arthur's name. As for Sandra and Chloe, I kept my word. I converted the ranch house into a scholarship dormitory. Every morning, my mother had to scrub the steps of the building she once used as a movie set. Every afternoon, Chloe had to manage the laundry for students who were actually studying the subjects she used to pretend to know. They were still in the house, but they were no longer the stars. They were the foundation they had never bothered to build. I stood on the porch of the cottage one final time, the mahogany box tucked under my arm. I looked at the garden, at the rosemary Arthur had loved, and at the valley that was finally at peace. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the legacy. Arthur Vance had given me more than billions. He had given me the truth. And as I turned to walk back into the home I had finally earned, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the money or the lawsuits. It was simply living a life that was finally, unmistakably real.